Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we've got a ClodBuster to get up and running. This one I got new in 97 or maybe 98, and after modifying the stock chassis I used my teenage skills to build a custom chassis. The first two versions were terrible, really quite bad. This one was the third attempt though, and actually resembles a proper chassis. It's made from aluminium stock from good old B&Q and a couple of bits of 2mm sheet. The links are M3 studding in a carbon fibre tube with Traxxas ball ends. I remember I really wanted to get a Clodzilla 3 or 4. I remember thinking they were the absolute pinnacle of RC monster trucks. Thundertech of course came up later with the all carbon fibre goodies, but I still have a bit of a soft spot for the old Clodzillas. This week then we're going to get the old rig up and running and see how it goes. I found an old high-tech servo that most likely lived on this chassis at some point in the past. It's high torque, but it's got plastic gears, hence the servo saver. For the ESC we've got a Model Sport Sniper. It's brushed of course, and a bit newer than the one I would have had in here originally. I think it would have been the cheapest ESC I could find with reverse once I replaced the mechanical speed control. For the radio, I'm going to go with a modern 2.4 GHz system. Now, I could dig out a 27 or 40 meg radio, but with the FlySky it's just going to be so much easier to get working without having to worry about range and glitches. Lastly, I've got a 6L9 my pack from a Chinese truck. It's the only one I have with a Tamiya connector, so it's going to have to do. I would have been running a 7-cell NiCad when I built the chassis, just for a little bit more oomph. When I packed it away, I was still using a 27 meg radio, which does date it a bit. It's a Futaba radio, so I was probably using a Futaba Attack 2 transmitter of some sort. Either way, we won't be needing it anymore, and we won't be needing the long antenna tube. Before we can start fitting all the bits and bobs, we need to give the chassis a quick clean. It's been sat on top of a wardrobe for well over a decade, and it's accumulated just a little bit of dust. It almost looks like it's been carpeted. I don't want to take it apart just yet, so the best thing to do is run a vacuum cleaner over it with a brush. We won't get all the dust off, but it's going to be much nicer to work on all the same. We'll start the refit by fitting the ESC. The two motors are wired up in parallel and end up at a couple of bullet connectors in the middle of the chassis. You can tell it was a teenage build. The insulation around the solder joints is good old masking tape because I probably didn't have enough money to buy electrical tape. It still works though, and surprisingly it hasn't fallen off. There's already some Velcro on the bottom of the chassis, so we'll just give the bottom of the ESC a quick clean with some alcohol and stick the other half of the Velcro on the bottom. Now we can connect up the motor wires to the ESC, yellow to red and blue to black. Pop the ESC on the Velcro and that's that bit done. Before we fit the servo we will hook up the radio and just quickly test the motors and centre the servo. If the motors or gearbox have a problem we're going to need to fix that before we can go any further. We've got the servo on channel 1 and the ESC on channel 2. A new model memory on the transmitter and the radios have been bound. I've lifted the axles up off the bench just in case it decides to take off. It's quite a heavy chassis, so you really don't want it to demolish everything in its path. Okay, here we go then. Let's see how it sounds. Yeah, well, that sounds okay. The gears have a huge pitch, so it's not going to sound like a touring car, but for a Clod it sounds just fine. It could probably do with some fresh grease, and it wouldn't surprise me if it's still running bushings. Proper bearings are quite expensive after all. Okay, on the front axle we have the axle mounted servo, which is really just a metal plate bolted on the side of the gearbox. Simple, but it works. There's a couple of mounting posts fitted to it, which most likely got borrowed off a Kyosho kit that never got them back. The servo just sits in a gap and gets held in with a couple of washerhead screws. The servo saver presses onto the splines and its screw gets fitted. All super simple stuff, but quite functional. The servo wires need to be attached to one of the upper lengths. There's lots of possible pinch points, so we'll just use a couple of zip ties to make sure that they're going to stay out of harm's way. To mount the receiver, we're just going to use some servo tape. but to make sure it sticks we're going to spray some alcohol around and give it a wipe down inside the chassis. It's not the best place for it as it's going to get sprayed with whatever the front wheels kick up in tight turns, but it'll work for now. To get the antenna up above the metalwork, we're going to zip tie some antenna tube to the cross brace. If we use 2 zip ties in a cross pattern, we can secure it without needing any screws or glue. That just leaves the power switch, which we'll use some more servo tape on and just stick it to the top of the chassis. The battery sits on the plastic shelf at the front of the chassis. Now I remember it was originally at the back, but the truck would always land with its nose facing straight up. I went through a few axle tubes with one-wheeled landings before I moved the pack to the front. Surprisingly, it then handled small jumps far better. Originally, to hold the pack in, there was just lots of rubber bands wrapped around the chassis, which have long since disintegrated. So I think it's time for a nice fresh one. If we're clever with it, we can hold the pack down without having to modify any of the parts. For the body, we've got a Pro-Line Hummer. Now, it's not the first body the chassis had on it. I think it was probably the 4th or 5th. It's got holes in the right places to mount it though, so it must have been on there at some point. It's also got holes to fit an Emax, which it spent quite a lot of time on. It's a bit dusty, so I'll give it a wash, and while it's drying we'll set up the steering endpoints. With the chassis upside down, we can go into the endpoint menu and set the endpoints on the transmitter. It's always quite critical to set them correctly. We don't want the servo to be constantly stressing more than it needs to when turning. Basically, we should be able to turn the wheel end to end without the steering on the truck hitting the end stops. It's quite a quick job and really extends the life of the servo, which is probably why this 20-year-old high-tech is still going. So here we go then. With the body on, we've got what's pretty close to my first custom build, a proper monster truck. Not one of these monster buggy truggy things everyone calls a monster truck these days. For the final ramblings, I'm going to cut to some outside testing. Now it's really quite windy outside at the moment at 40 odd miles an hour, so the sound isn't all that useful. But you can see the old truck run. It's not fast, it's not stable, the suspension's a bit stiff, but I think it's fun. I do kind of miss the early 2000s when it was all about monster trucks rather than the crawler and scale trucks we have now. I feel like there was a bit more creativity in the builds, and like me, lots more people trying to build custom rigs with just a hacksaw and a set of drills. I'm sure there was more positive discussions too. It didn't matter if your build was a hardware store special. It might just be selective memory on my part, but forums like RCMT, RC Monster Trucks, were great. I met people in the IRC channel that I still talk to now. I think what we'll do with the Clod then is open up the gearboxes and see what's inside, fit some bearings and clean them up. Next, some slightly warmer motors, probably with a LiPo-friendly ESC. Then there's a couple of modern chassis on eBay that are mighty tempting. Maybe I can put together the Clod I was trying to emulate 20 odd years ago. So there we go then, yet another project on the list. I'm still waiting for bits to arrive for the Mauler and WPL C44, so with any luck we'll be able to get back on them fairly soon. As always then, thanks for watching. Like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, leave a message if there's something on your mind, and long live the Clod. Bye guys!